In 2026, the Port of New Orleans runs like a precise machine. High-definition cameras track every container that moves across the docks. Digital systems record weight, origin, destination, and time down to the second. Federal auditors can trace an entire shipment with just a few clicks. Nothing comes in. Nothing goes out without a record. The cranes still groan against the wind rolling off the Mississippi. The trucks still line up before sunrise. But now there are sensors in the cables, satellite tracking in the engines, and oversight in every corner of the yard. Even the night shift, the one that used to mean fewer eyes watching, now answers to strict procedures. The port is efficient, secure, predictable, and maybe that's exactly why most people don't stop to think about how it used to work. Because there was a time when the Port of New Orleans didn't run on cameras, it ran on men. Back in 1974, there were no digital tracking systems. Records were typed or written by hand on carbon paper. Clipboards passed from one worker to the next. A signature carried more weight than a barcode ever could. The union wasn't just an organization. It was authority. It was protection. It was reputation. If something moved through the docks at night, often the only people who truly knew about it were the men standing there in the heat, and whatever they decided, or chose not to question, usually stayed between them and the river. That summer of 1974 was heavy with humidity, the kind of heat that clung to your shirt long after sunset, and on one of those thick July nights, a shipment arrived with paperwork that looked complete at first glance. Stamped, signed, cleared for loading. The instructions were simple. Load it, send it. Nothing about it screamed trouble, not unless you looked twice, but someone did. Years later, an engineer would casually mention in a quiet bar conversation that a particular batch of equipment never reached its final destination in the Gulf of Mexico. He would say that if it had, there was a real chance something might have failed under pressure. He couldn't explain why the shipment never arrived. Official records showed everything in order, but on the docks, in the summer of 1974, someone made a decision that never made it onto paper. Today, the port runs on surveillance, compliance, and digital oversight. Back then, it ran on something far less measurable and far more fragile: reputation. And on one ordinary night, during a shift that should have been like any other, a veteran longshoreman had to decide what mattered more: the silence that kept things moving, or the weight of sending something downriver that never should have left the dock. To understand that decision, you have to go back to the heat, back to the cranes, back to a time when the tide would rise and fall, but a man's name could last much longer than the water beneath it. In 1974, the Port of New Orleans wasn't a postcard. It wasn't the French Quarter or neon lights glowing over late-night music drifting through open windows. The port sat lower, closer to the thick brown current of the Mississippi River, where the smell wasn't spices or bourbon. It was diesel fuel, hot steel, and old water. The docks woke up before the sun did. Trucks lined up in the dark with engines idling, headlights cutting through the river fog that rolled in heavy before dawn. Chains clanked. Cables tightened with a deep metallic strain. Cranes groaned as they swung into motion. It wasn't chaos. It was rhythm. Every man out there knew his place in that rhythm. The younger ones watched before they spoke. The older ones spoke less than they watched. Movements were measured. Energy was conserved. A shift could run long, and wasted strength had a way of finding you by the end of it. The port wasn't modern, and it wasn't clean, but it worked. Shipments came through daily. Industrial machinery, grain, mechanical parts, sealed crates, reinforced with steel bands. Some were headed offshore to oil platforms in the Gulf. Others were bound for factories inland. Most didn't stay long. The docks were a passageway, not a destination. What kept everything running wasn't technology. It was reputation. If a man made a mistake, people remembered. If he cut corners, word spread. And once your name carried doubt in a place like that, it stayed with you longer than any bruise or sore back. The union was more than an organization. It was the backbone of the place. For many of those men, the job wasn't just employment. It was inheritance. Fathers had worked those docks, grandfathers before them. Boys grew up hearing stories about the river at the dinner table long before they were old enough to lift a crate. There were written rules, sure, but the ones that mattered most were never printed. Don't embarrass a man in public. Don't ask questions that aren't yours to ask. Protect your shift, and never let someone from outside the docks decide what happens inside them. Those rules weren't explained. They were absorbed by watching. The summer of 1974 came in thick and heavy. The heat didn't lift after sunset the way it sometimes did in spring. Shirts clung to backs. Concrete soaked up the sun all day and gave it back slowly through the soles of work boots. Night shifts were sought after, not because they were easier, but because they spared you the worst of the sun. And sometimes there were fewer supervisors walking the yard. Paperwork moved quicker. Certain shipments passed through with less delay. Nothing illegal, just fewer eyes. Among the men working those docks that year was a longshoreman with 25 years behind him. He wasn't the tallest man on the crew, nor the strongest anymore. Age had settled into his joints, and the speed of his youth had been replaced with something steadier. But when he walked across the yard, people noticed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His name had survived a quarter century on that concrete without public stain. In a place like that, that meant something. He had come to the docks as a young man, led there by his father one cold gray morning years before. He still remembered the smell of the river that day, mud and fuel and something ancient. His father hadn't given him a speech, just pointed toward the cranes and said, "If you're going to work here, work right." That was the only lesson he ever needed. Over the years, he had turned down favors that would have made life easier. Small adjustments to paperwork, suggestions to overlook minor weight differences. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just shortcuts. His answer was always the same. If it's right, it doesn't need a shortcut. He never said it to sound righteous. He said it because he believed it. By 1974, he was a father himself. His son had recently been accepted into the union, a quiet source of pride, marked not by celebration, but by a firm handshake and a simple family dinner. In that house, accomplishments weren't announced loudly. They were acknowledged and carried forward. The boy started with the heavier shifts. He worked hard, watched closely, and tried not to lean too much on his father's name. Out on the docks, he stood a little straighter when he thought no one noticed. But 1974 wasn't the same world it had been 25 years earlier. The oil crisis tightened contracts. Companies pushed for faster turnaround. Deadlines mattered more. Inspection time grew shorter. There was pressure, not spoken openly, but felt. Supervisors began to move with more urgency. Forms were adjusted before being passed along. Some checks were done by eye instead of by procedure. Still, to most men, the port remained what it had always been. The shift began. The cargo moved. The whistle blew. Men went home. Until that summer, when something small began to shift. There was no announcement, no emergency meeting, just a pattern. Certain industrial shipments began arriving with less detailed documentation. Some loads were scheduled almost exclusively for night shifts, and certain names started appearing more often on those night rosters. One of those names was his son's. It wasn't a formal promotion, but it was opportunity. Better shifts meant extra hours. Extra hours meant money. And for a young man building a life, that mattered. The father noticed. He didn't comment, not yet, on the docks. Suspicion without proof could do more damage than the problem itself. Distrust spread quickly in places where men relied on one another for safety. But one night, near the end of a shift, he paused a little longer than usual. A shipment of large industrial crates was being loaded with unusual speed. The paperwork moved fast. A question about a missing signature was waved off with a short gesture and a casual, "It's already cleared." Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. He didn't confront anyone that night, but he didn't leave easy either. The river kept flowing. Ships kept coming and going. The Union remained strong. The city above the docks kept dancing to brass music and late-night laughter. Yet down at the waterline, something had begun to lean slightly off balance. It wasn't corruption. Not yet. It was accommodation. And accommodation, when repeated often enough, stops feeling like an exception and starts feeling like normal. That night, after the final whistle, he stood watching a freighter ease its way down the Mississippi, lights shimmering on the dark surface. For the first time in a long while, he had the feeling that this summer would not pass like the others. There was no proof yet, no accusation, no decision to make, but the tide was beginning to shift. And on the docks, when the tide shifts, the men who don't pay attention are usually the ones carried away by it. His name was Raymond Boudreau. On the docks, most men just called him Ray, but there was something in the way they said it. It wasn't casual familiarity. It was recognition. Raymond was 55 that summer. His shoulders weren't as broad as they had been at 30, but they still carried weight without complaint. His hands were thick, scarred from years of cuts and rope burns, the kind of marks that never fully disappear. He didn't move fast anymore. He moved steady. He understood that a long shift wasn't won in the first hour. It was endured. He had come to the port as a young man, brought there by his father one gray winter morning. He still remembered how the cranes looked against the sky that day, tall and patient. His father hadn't given a speech. He had simply nodded toward the yard and said, "If you're going to stay here, stay right." That was the only instruction he ever needed. Raymond never chased position. He never tried to become a supervisor. He never campaigned for union office. He preferred steel under his boots to paperwork behind a desk, preferred being part of the work instead of above it. Over the years, he had been offered small favors, suggestions to smooth out numbers on a form, invitations to overlook minor discrepancies in weight, nothing that would have made headlines, just shortcuts. His answer was always the same. If it's right, it doesn't need help. He didn't say it to judge anyone. He said it because it was the way he had decided to live. At home, the silence carried a similar rhythm to the docks. His wife, Claire, understood her husband without needing explanations. He wasn't a man who brought work home in words, but when something weighed on him, it showed. He grew quieter, sat a little longer before speaking. Their son, Daniel, who was 22 and new to the union, strong shoulders, steady hands, and the quiet hunger of a young man who wants to prove himself. Daniel admired his father, but he didn't want to live in his shadow. He wanted his own reputation, his own name on those docks. In the early weeks, Raymond watched from a distance. He didn't interfere, didn't correct unless necessary. The docks had their own way of teaching lessons, and most of them couldn't be delivered in conversation. Daniel learned quickly. He listened. He worked hard. And when the first night shifts offering overtime came around, he accepted without hesitation. "It's a chance, Dad," Daniel had said one evening while washing his hands at the kitchen sink. "Can't just wait around for the good hours." Raymond had nodded. He understood ambition. He remembered it well, but there was something about the way those shifts were being handed out that unsettled him. There was no formal promotion, no written criteria, just certain names appearing more often than others, Daniel's name among them. One humid afternoon before a shift, Raymond crossed paths with the supervisor near Warehouse 3. The exchange was brief, casual on the surface. "Your boy's doing good," the supervisor said, adjusting his cap. "He's got drive. Men like that move up fast." Raymond thanked him, but the phrase lingered. Move up fast. On the docks, moving too fast sometimes meant someone was pushing from behind. That week, Raymond watched another shipment being loaded under the night lights, documentation moving quicker than it should have. Daniel was part of the crew securing the crates to the crane hooks, focused, determined to show he belonged. Raymond felt something then that wasn't quite fear. It was anticipation. He knew there would come a moment Maybe not that night, maybe not that week, when Daniel would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be on those docks. And Raymond also knew that some decisions cannot be taught. They have to be chosen. Later that night, as the ship eased away from the dock and its lights reflected across the dark water, Raymond understood that the port was shifting beneath its surface, not in a way that made headlines, not in a way that stopped operations, but in a quieter way. And this time, it wasn't just his own name that might be tested. It was the future of the Boudreaux name on that river. The night shift always carried a different kind of rhythm at the port of New Orleans. During the day, the yard was noise layered over noise, engines revving, cranes grinding, men shouting short instructions over the wind. At night, the sound thinned out. It stretched. Metal seemed to echo longer. The Mississippi reflected the dock lights like it was watching in silence. Raymond had worked enough nights to know that things didn't move the same way after dark. The work wasn't lighter, but it felt more concentrated. Fewer supervisors walked the yard. Paperwork moved faster. Decisions were made with less discussion. That week in July, the night shifts had been unusually busy. A series of industrial shipments needed to move before the end of the fiscal quarter. That was the explanation passed around. There was urgency, but not panic, just pressure. On Wednesday, a truck rolled in through a side gate that wasn't used often. Not illegal, just uncommon. The driver handed over paperwork that had already been partially stamped and signed. Raymond wasn't assigned to that specific loading zone, but he could see enough from where he stood. The crates were large, reinforced with steel bands, thick wood, minimal identification painted on the sides, industrial equipment bound for offshore platforms, most likely. Nothing strange in that. What caught his attention wasn't the cargo itself. It was the pace. No detailed cross-check. No second review. The supervisor glanced at the forms and gave a short nod. "Send it through." One of the younger men started to ask about declared weight. The supervisor cut him off before he finished. "It's cleared." The tone was quick, too quick. Raymond didn't step in, didn't question openly, but he began watching more closely. Daniel was part of the crew attaching the crates to the crane lines. He worked efficiently, focused on the task, absorbing every instruction like it was a step forward in proving himself. Raymond recognized that energy. He had once carried it himself, but something about the shipment felt slightly off. Normally, equipment headed for offshore platforms came with detailed documentation, batch numbers, inspection records, technical specifications clearly attached. These were sensitive components. If something failed under pressure, the consequences weren't minor. That night, the forms were simplified, stamped, signed, but lacking detail. Maybe it was administrative oversight. Maybe it was nothing. The problem wasn't what was visible. It was what was missing. When the first crate lifted off the dock under the crane's tension, Raymond noticed a faint shift in the internal balance. The metal inside didn't sound fully secured, not dramatically loose, just not right. He had loaded hundreds of similar shipments over the years. You learn to recognize the sound of solid weight. This wasn't that. He stepped forward casually, as if adjusting his own position, and studied the straps. They were tight, structurally correct. Still, there was a hollow knock inside the crate that didn't match the declared weight. The supervisor caught his glance. "Something wrong, Ray?" The question came with a half-smile. "Just looking," Raymond replied evenly. The supervisor held his gaze a moment longer than necessary. The crate lowered into the ship's hold without delay. One after another they followed. No long pauses. No careful rechecking. Later, Daniel walked over while wiping his hands on his work pants. "Equipment for the new platforms," he said. "They're expanding production out there." Raymond nodded. "You see the specs?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "Office checks that before it gets here." That was true, but it wasn't a full answer. After the shift ended, Raymond walked toward the side warehouse where documentation was temporarily stored before being sent to the main office. It wasn't unusual for a veteran to glance at records. Experience carried a certain quiet access. He flipped through a few copies. The signatures were there, but two of them looked almost identical. Same slant, same pressure, Same spacing. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. He closed the folder without comment. Later that night at the bar near the docks, conversation stayed light. Football talk, oil contracts, laughter short and casual. The supervisor sat at the counter, like always, drinking slow, saying nothing unusual. Nothing on the surface suggested serious wrongdoing. And that was exactly what bothered him. There was nothing large enough to justify confrontation. Just small details, small omissions, small repetitions. On Friday, another shipment arrived. Same pattern, same night shift, same group assigned. This time, Raymond noticed something else. One of the batch numbers painted on a crate looked recently covered and reapplied. The paint texture didn't match the rest of the surface. He ran his hand lightly across it. Fresh. He didn't say a word, but doubt had shifted into pattern, and pattern meant intention. Daniel seemed energized by the extra hours. He talked about steady income, about future plans. Raymond listened. He didn't want to raise alarm without certainty, but he also couldn't ignore what he was seeing. During the third week of similar shipments, he overheard two workers speaking quietly near the storage racks. Fragments of conversation, something about equipment coming straight from the line without final inspection, about the company cutting corners to meet deadlines. Raymond didn't hear every word. He didn't need to. If it was true, this wasn't about accounting shortcuts. It was about risk. Offshore platforms ran under extreme pressure. Equipment failure out there didn't mean inconvenience. It meant fire. It meant men trapped miles from shore. That night, after the last crane powered down, and the ship eased into the dark current of the Mississippi, Raymond stood watching the lights drift away. He didn't have proof. He didn't have confession, but he had repetition, and repetition turns suspicion into responsibility. He still hadn't confronted anyone, hadn't spoken to the union, hadn't sat down with his son for a serious talk, but a line was being drawn in front of him, and he knew that if it kept moving in the same direction, he wouldn't be able to pretend he hadn't seen it. Summer had only just begun, but something at the docks was no longer running on trust alone, and when trust begins to lean too heavily on silence, the weight stops being in the crates. It settles on the men carrying them. The following week, no one mentioned the previous shipments. At the port of New Orleans, silence didn't mean ignorance. It meant a choice. And that summer, many men were choosing not to look too closely. Trucks continued coming through the side gate at irregular hours. The paperwork arrived mostly prepared, stamped, signed, ready to move. What was missing wasn't documentation. It was scrutiny. Raymond began to see the pattern more clearly now. Industrial equipment bound for offshore platforms was being scheduled almost entirely for night shifts. Not every load, but the heavier ones. The more technical ones, the ones that, under normal conditions, would require careful verification. The supervisor explained it as logistical efficiency, less congestion at night, faster turnaround. It made sense on the surface, but when efficiency starts to travel alongside urgency, it often carries something else with it. Daniel was being placed in those night crews more and more often. He earned overtime. He received quiet public praise. One evening, the supervisor gave him responsibility for coordinating the securing of a specific shipment. It wasn't a formal promotion, but it was trust. Raymond watched from a distance. Daniel worked with focus, standing straighter under that responsibility, absorbing direction with the eagerness of someone determined to build a future. There was no dishonesty in the boy. There was confidence, and at that moment, confidence was the most fragile element in the yard. At the bar, after one shift, the tone of conversation shifted slightly. Some of the older men spoke about expanding oil production in the Gulf. The country needed more energy. Contracts were worth real money. If we don't move it, another port will, one veteran said before taking a slow drink. It wasn't a threat, it was economic reality. Raymond understood pressure. He understood deadlines. He understood that supervisors answered to people above them, and that the union wasn't immune to financial strain. The issue wasn't the logic, it was the cost. By the third consecutive week of accelerated night shipments, something more visible happened. One of the crates shifted awkwardly during a crane lift. It didn't fall. It didn't crack open, but the metal inside struck the wood with a hollow sound that carried further than it should have. Raymond caught the quick exchange of glances between two seasoned workers. No one commented. The crate was adjusted. Straps tightened. Work resumed. Later that evening at home, Daniel mentioned it casually. That load wasn't balanced right inside. Came that way sealed. Not our call. Raymond looked at him carefully. And you think that's enough? Daniel hesitated. It's not our job to open sealed crates. Technically correct, but not complete. The next morning, Raymond arrived early, quietly. He asked to review documentation from previous shipments, not as accusation, as verification. The office clerk hesitated. That's supervisor level. Raymond didn't raise his voice. My name's on those forms. If I handled the load, I have the right to see it. That was true. After a few minutes, the records were placed in front of him. 3 previous batches, same certification reference number, same inspection signature, repeated. The signature wasn't just similar. It was identical in a way handwriting rarely is. Raymond wasn't an expert in penmanship, but he had seen enough real signatures over 25 years to recognize repetition when it didn't belong. That afternoon, the supervisor approached him while the crew organized tools. You've been watching pretty close lately, Ray. The tone was light, measured. I always do, Raymond replied. The supervisor studied him for a moment. Sometimes you have to trust that the people above have already handled what needs handling. There it was, above, not just logistics anymore, hierarchy. Raymond nodded without answering. When a system begins defending itself before it's accused, something has already shifted. Later that week, a different transport truck arrived through the same side entrance. Out-of-state plates, paperwork even more streamlined than before. Daniel was assigned again. Raymond felt something new that night, not suspicion, proximity. If there was real wrongdoing buried in those shipments, Daniel was standing closer to it than ever. During the lift, Raymond noticed a discrepancy between the declared weight and the strain in the crane cable, small but real. He walked casually toward the auxiliary scale. The number registered within tolerance. Barely, small enough to dismiss, large enough to question. No one questioned it, because questioning meant delay. Delay meant cost. And that summer, cost was a word no one wanted attached to their ship. When the ship finally pushed away from the dock and began its slow turn into the current, Raymond remained standing long after others had moved on. 3 weeks, 4 similar shipments. Same pattern, same reduced inspection, same recurring crew assignments. This wasn't random. It was system, and once a mistake becomes routine, it stops looking like a mistake. It starts looking like normal. That night, Raymond made the first quiet decision that would change everything. He wouldn't accuse without evidence. He wouldn't explode publicly, but he would not stand by and pretend this was simple logistics anymore. If those shipments were what they appeared to be, industrial components moving offshore without proper final inspection, then the cost wouldn't be financial. It would be human, and he would not allow the Boudreaux name to sit quietly beside something that could cost lives. He didn't yet know how he would act, but he knew he would. The port continued humming around him. Cranes lifted, trucks rolled, paperwork passed hands. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm, something had begun to corrode, and Raymond understood that sooner or later, someone would have to say the tide had crossed its line. He suspected there wouldn't be many volunteers. By the 4th week of that summer, the pattern was no longer just repetition. It became confirmation. The shipment that night looked like the others. Reinforced wooden crates, streamlined paperwork, controlled urgency. The vessel docked, had come from Houston, and was headed toward one of the newer offshore platforms in the Gulf, structures built to handle greater extraction pressure as production expanded. Raymond knew the type of equipment involved. Years earlier, he had helped load similar components: pressure control valves, hydraulic modules, containment systems designed to hold back forces most men never see up close. When those parts failed, it wasn't a maintenance issue. It was explosion. It was fire. It was men stranded miles offshore with no quick way home. That night, a small procedural hiccup created the opening Raymond needed. One of the crates had to be repositioned before final loading. A metal strap was slightly misaligned, not dangerously so, but enough to require adjustment. During the maneuver, the crate struck the edge of the ship's hold with a sharp crack. The wood split along one seam. Not enough to shatter, enough to reveal. Raymond stepped forward first. Inside, the metal housing of the component showed irregular wear along its fitting edges, fine scoring marks, surface inconsistencies beneath fresh paint. It did not look new. It looked refurbished. Or worse, it looked reused without proper final inspection. He ran his fingers lightly across the exposed edge. Beneath the layer of recent paint were hairline fractures, small enough to escape casual notice, large enough to compromise structural integrity under full pressure. The supervisor moved in quickly. "Seal that up," he said, voice controlled. "No need to slow this down over a cosmetic split." Raymond didn't raise his voice. "That's not cosmetic," the supervisor exhaled through his nose. "It's certified." Raymond knew the paperwork said it was, but he was beginning to question who had certified it. Daniel stood only a few yards away, watching the exchange without fully grasping the stakes. Raymond understood in that moment that the larger danger wasn't the cracked wood. It was what would happen if he forced confrontation publicly. If he challenged it outright, Daniel's name would sit in the middle of whatever followed. If he stayed silent, the crate would sail south. He chose a measured line. "It needs a damage report," he said evenly. "Standard procedure." The supervisor hesitated. A damage report meant documentation, not scandal, but attention. It meant the shipment could not simply move unnoticed. After a pause long enough to measure tension, the supervisor nodded. "Make it quick." The crate was pulled back from the hold. Under formal inspection, the split in the wood widened. What had been suspicion became visible evidence. 2 internal valves showed microfractures near the pressure joints, fine cracks spidering outward beneath the paint layer. A technician called in for review studied the component quietly. "This won't hold full load," he muttered under his breath. The supervisor drew him aside. Their conversation stayed low. No shouting, no public accusation, but the air tightened. If that piece was officially rejected, it wouldn't stop at one crate. It would raise questions about every similar shipment from the past weeks. Contracts could stall, payments could freeze. Blame would need a place to land. Daniel approached his father once the technician stepped back. "Is it that serious?" Raymond didn't dramatize. "Offshore, there's no such thing as almost serious." The words stayed with Daniel. After a brief internal discussion, the decision was announced. That particular crate would be held for further inspection the next day. The rest of the shipment would proceed as scheduled. It was a compromise. Controlled, politically manageable, but Raymond's concern had already widened beyond that single unit. If one valve carried stress fractures, how many others had already been sent downriver? How many were installed miles offshore, holding back pressure at that very moment? How many men trusted equipment that might not have been fully cleared? That night, Raymond didn't go straight to the dinner table. He sat first on the porch, listening to the faint sound of a passing ship horn drifting from the river. Claire stepped into the doorway. Something happened. It wasn't a question. "Maybe," he answered. He didn't explain further, but she knew the difference between ordinary silence and the kind that carries weight. The next morning, Raymond returned early to the docks. He asked to review previous shipment records again, this time with sharper intent. The office staff resisted lightly. "That's supervisor business." Raymond's tone stayed calm. "If my hands were on those loads, I need to see what I signed." Eventually, the paperwork was laid out. 3 prior batches. Same certification number repeated, same inspection signature, perfectly replicated. Not similar, replicated. The sequence of batch numbers sat too close together to feel accidental. Raymond felt the shift fully then. This wasn't just rushed oversight. It was reused certification applied across multiple shipments. And now there was documented structural failure in at least one crate. That changed everything. When Daniel arrived for his shift, he could see something had settled in his father's posture. "You going to the union?" Raymond answered simply. "I'm going to speak to the man who needs to hear it." It wasn't threat, it was decision. The line he had watched forming all summer had been crossed. If he pushed this forward, supervisors could face scrutiny, contracts could tremble, his son could lose standing in the yard. If he let it go, men offshore might someday pay the price. There was no comfortable exit. The docks continued operating around them as if nothing had changed. Cranes lifted, paperwork moved, engines idled. But for Raymond, every sound felt heavier. The weight was no longer in the crates. It was in the choice in front of him, and he understood that whatever he did next would not simply protect or damage a shipment. It would define the Boudreaux name for the rest of its time on that river. The tide had risen past safe ground. Now someone had to decide whether to let it keep rising. The port looked the same the next morning. Trucks rolled through the gates. Cranes swung into motion. Men adjusted their gloves before the whistle. But for Raymond, the rhythm had changed. When a man carries certainty, even the ordinary sounds feel heavier. He didn't head straight to the loading yard that morning. Instead, he walked toward the low brick building that housed the union office. The place smelled of old coffee and paper that had been stacked too long. Framed photographs lined the walls, images of past strikes, crowded meetings, men standing shoulder to shoulder, with fists raised in defense of wages and dignity. The union wasn't just structure, it was memory, it was protection, it was power. Frank Delacroix had been union leader for nearly 15 years. Broad-shouldered, deliberate in speech, known for standing firm when companies pushed too hard. Raymond didn't walk in making accusations. He sat down, waited for the door to close. "What is it, Ray?" Frank asked, already sensing something different in his posture. Raymond laid the copied certification papers on the desk. He didn't speak first. He let Frank read. Frank's expression shifted gradually, from neutral to attentive to tight. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure enough." There was no raised voice, no fist on the desk. Just gravity. Frank understood the implications. If certification had been reused or falsified, it wouldn't stop at the supplier. The port's reputation would be entangled, the union's oversight questioned. "And what are you asking?" Frank said carefully. "Hold the next shipments until full review." The sentence was short. The consequences were not. Holding shipments meant delayed contracts. Delayed contracts meant financial penalties. Penalties meant pressure from above. Pressure meant conflict. Frank stood and looked out the window for a long moment. "You know what that sets off," he said. Raymond nodded. "I know what not doing it sets off." The silence that followed measured more than policy. Frank had known Raymond for decades. He knew he wasn't impulsive, knew he didn't chase attention. If he brought something forward, it wasn't for leverage, but larger interests were at stake. "You understand your boy's name is on those shifts," Frank added. "That's why I'm here." There it was, not defiance. Clarity. Frank picked up the phone, not dialing yet, just turning the cord between his fingers. "Give me a day," he said finally. "One day to verify before we shut anything down." Raymond nodded. One day. He left without drama. Out in the yard, something subtle had already shifted. Rumors travel faster than cranes. The supervisor avoided eye contact that morning. Daniel approached near midday. "What did you do?" There was no accusation in his tone, only concern. "I asked for review," Raymond said. Daniel exhaled slowly. "You know that could put me on the wrong list." The words weren't angry, they were afraid. Raymond studied his son's face for a moment. This was the cost he had expected, the part that cut closest. "If there's a wrong list," Raymond answered. "It was already there before I spoke." Daniel didn't respond immediately, but something in him had begun to understand. That afternoon, an internal notice circulated. Industrial shipments, scheduled for the coming week, were placed under temporary technical review, pending certification verification. The word temporary was underlined twice. The supervisor read the notice with tight lips. A few men muttered. Most kept working. Raymond felt the ripple move outward like oil across water. That night at the bar, conversation felt thinner. The supervisor entered, ordered a drink, and kept his distance. One of the older men leaned toward Raymond quietly. "You stirred something big. Maybe. Sometimes stability matters more than correction." Raymond held his gaze. "Without correction, there isn't stability." The man didn't argue. The next morning, 2 representatives from the supplier company arrived at the dock. Clean shirts, polished shoes, clipboards in hand. Frank met them. Inspection began. Crates were opened. Components examined. More microfractures surfaced, not in every piece, but in enough to confirm concern. The official explanation was contained and careful. Limited quality control deviation in a specific batch. Preventive recall, no systemic issue. Controlled language, but the essential fact stood. If the shipments had moved unchecked, the risk would have been real. Daniel watched part of the inspection from a distance. When he saw the second valve pulled aside for structural weakness, the last of his doubt faded. There was no triumph in Raymond's posture. No victory, just quiet steadiness. That evening at home, Daniel sat at the table before dinner. "If that had gone through," he began. "It could have failed," Raymond finished. Daniel nodded. "And if this costs me position here?" Raymond took his time answering. "You can rebuild position," he said. "You can't rebuild a name." It wasn't lecture. It was inheritance. The port didn't shut down. Operations reorganized. The supplier replaced the affected batch. Officially, the matter was procedural. No headlines, no scandal. But everyone on the docks knew what had been prevented. Raymond received no public thanks, no promotion, no plaque. What he received was distance. Some co-workers greeted him with polite restraint. Others avoided longer conversation. The supervisor maintained professionalism without warmth. The system didn't remove him, but it didn't embrace him either. Raymond accepted that because he knew the port would continue, and now it would continue with review. Somewhere out in the Gulf, men would never know that a flawed shipment had been held back on a humid night in 1974. They would never know a longshoreman had insisted on looking twice, but Raymond would know. The decision was made, irreversible, and the cost, whatever remained of it, was one he could carry. In the days that followed the extraordinary review, the Port of New Orleans continued operating with the same outward appearance it had always carried. Ships docked, cargo moved, paperwork flowed through offices with steady rhythm. But for the men who worked those docks, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't visible to visitors or auditors. It was felt in the pauses between greetings, in the way conversations shortened when certain footsteps approached. The technical audit confirmed what Raymond had suspected. Portions of the batch showed structural weaknesses incompatible with the pressure demands of offshore platforms. The supplier acknowledged a limited quality control deviation and agreed to replace the affected components before final shipment. Officially, it was handled as a preventive correction. No admission of falsified certification, no public scandal, no federal investigation splashed across headlines. On paper, the matter was contained. On the docks, it was understood. Raymond didn't seek acknowledgement. He hadn't acted to be proven right. Still, he felt the weight of having disrupted a current that had been flowing quietly for weeks. The supervisor maintained professional courtesy, but the ease between them was gone. Where there had once been casual conversation, there was now measured distance. Raymond had crossed an invisible boundary, the line separating those who adapt quietly from those who insist on correction. Daniel began to feel the consequences more directly. His night assignments grew less frequent. Leadership opportunities drifted toward other names. Nothing official, nothing provable, but enough to recognize a shift in positioning. One afternoon, father and son worked the same section of the yard, handling routine inland freight that required focus, but not urgency. The scrape of wood against steel filled the space between them for several minutes before Daniel spoke. "They're saying it was overblown," he said carefully. "That small issues like that have happened before. and nothing serious came from it. Raymond kept working before responding. He had learned long ago that answers offered too quickly rarely settle deep. Sometimes the problem isn't what already happened, he said at last. It's what happens when everyone decides nothing ever will. Daniel absorbed that quietly. There was no pride in his father's voice, no satisfaction in being vindicated, just steadiness. At home, Claire sensed the tension not as open conflict, but as adjustment. Daniel's conversations shifted from ambition to procedure. He began asking about older inspection practices, about how things were checked before modern systems existed. We didn't have computers, Raymond explained one evening, but we had a habit of looking twice, not because someone required it, because we knew what could happen if we didn't. It wasn't nostalgia, it was perspective. Back at the port, the episode gradually became categorized as isolated. Routine returned, yet small changes remained. Slightly longer inspections, more careful documentation, less casual dismissal of irregularities during night shifts. No one framed it as reform, but it was. One evening, as Raymond lingered after his shift, watching a freighter maneuver into the darkening current, he thought about the men working miles offshore. Most of them would never know that one shipment had been paused long enough to prevent risk. There was no applause in prevention, no ceremony for what did not happen. Still, he felt something settle inside him. Not pride, relief. Relief carries a quiet dignity when earned honestly. The cost, however, lingered in subtler ways. Some colleagues maintained distance out of caution, perhaps wary that conversation around him carried weight. Others, older men who had spent decades on the same concrete, offered quiet gestures of respect, a nod, a longer handshake. Nothing dramatic. One of them, hair thinning and hands permanently scarred from years of rope work, stood beside him one afternoon watching a vessel dock. Not many would have pushed that, the man said without turning his head. Not many needed to, Raymond replied. There was no false humility in the exchange, just mutual understanding. Daniel overheard part of it from a distance. For the first time since that humid night in July, he began to grasp the full measure of what his father had done. It hadn't been stubbornness. It hadn't been ego. It had been calculation, measured against consequence. That realization didn't transform him overnight. It worked gradually, like the tide creeping higher against the dock's edge. Weeks passed. August softened into early fall. The oppressive heat eased slightly, though the air remained thick. The port continued its steady cycle of arrivals and departures. But something essential had been reinforced. Raymond knew the entire system hadn't changed. That would have been too much to expect. But a line had been redrawn. The boundary between oversight and risk had been made visible again, and the Boudreaux name had crossed that test without stain. He understood perhaps more clearly than ever that integrity rarely produces celebration. More often it produces isolation for a time, but isolation is lighter than regret. Each night he slept. That was enough. Years later, when men would recall that summer in passing conversation, they would not describe it as dramatic. There were no sirens, no courtroom testimonies, no headlines. They would remember it as the time when someone chose not to let a pattern become permanent. And in a place like the port of New Orleans, that choice mattered more than anyone said out loud. The summer of 1974 ended without spectacle. There were no federal investigations splashed across newspapers, no executives escorted off the docks under public scrutiny. The matter of the defective valves was absorbed into the machinery of contracts and compliance, the way many near disasters are absorbed when they never become tragedy. Replacement batches were issued, certifications were quietly reviewed, language in reports was carefully chosen. Officially, it had been precautionary, but for the men who had been there, something had shifted in a way that paperwork could not record. Raymond did not revisit the episode in conversation, not because he wished to forget it, but because he believed that decisions lose strength when repeated for approval. He returned to his work as he always had, checking loads, guiding younger hands when needed, keeping his shift steady. The difference lay in the way others regarded him. Some maintained distance, cautious perhaps that proximity might be interpreted as alignment. Others, especially those who had been on the docks, long enough to understand quiet consequence, offered respect in subtler ways. A pause before speaking, a nod, held a second longer. Daniel, meanwhile, underwent a slower transformation. The initial frustration of lost opportunity gave way to a more thoughtful attention to detail. He began asking questions not out of challenge, but out of responsibility. He studied documentation more carefully. He watched procedures not for shortcuts, but for gaps. One afternoon in early autumn, while overseeing a routine inland shipment, Daniel noticed a minor discrepancy between the declared weight and the auxiliary scale reading. It was small enough to ignore, within tolerance. The supervisor suggested moving forward without delay. Daniel hesitated. For a brief moment, the temptation to avoid inconvenience nearly won. After all, nothing seemed wrong. No visible damage. No urgent red flag. Then he remembered his father's steady posture beside that cracked crate, the way he had held his ground without raising his voice, the calm conviction that did not depend on audience. "I think we should log it," Daniel said evenly. There was no confrontation, just a short delay, a second measurement. The difference turned out to be a clerical error. Nothing more, but the gesture mattered. Raymond observed from a distance, pretending attention elsewhere. But noting everything, he did not smile. He did not congratulate. He simply continued working, aware that something important had taken root. Years moved forward, as they always do. Contracts changed hands. New supervisors rotated through. Economic cycles rose and fell. Raymond's body began to carry more visible signs of time. Knees stiffened after long shifts. Mornings required a little more stretching before motion felt easy. In 1989, on a morning cooler than most in New Orleans, he signed his retirement papers. There was no ceremony with banners or speeches, just a small gathering near the dock. A few men shaking his hand firmly, some clapping him on the shoulder with the reserved warmth of those who share labor rather than language. Frank Delacroix, though still union leader, approached him quietly. "You did what had to be done that summer," Frank said. It was the only direct acknowledgement in 15 years. Raymond nodded once. "That's enough," he replied. Retirement revealed a quieter rhythm. For the first time since his youth, his days were not governed by whistles and shift calls. He spent mornings on the front porch with coffee and the newspaper folded across his lap. The distant horns of ships still carried through the air on certain afternoons, and each time he heard them, something in him answered. The Mississippi remained constant. Daniel stayed at the port. Over time, he built a reputation distinct from his father's, but grounded in the same line that separates convenience from responsibility. He did not pursue authority aggressively, but leadership found him gradually, as it often does when steadiness outlasts ambition. When he was eventually given supervisory responsibility in one of the industrial sectors, he implemented a practice without announcement: dual verification for high-risk equipment, not because policy demanded it, but because experience did. No one referenced 1974 when the procedures were adopted. They didn't need to. Doc memory is rarely written, but it is rarely lost. In the mid-1990s, an offshore platform in the Gulf experienced equipment failure supplied by a different contractor. The incident triggered widespread reviews of inspection standards across multiple ports. One evening, in the same bar that had hosted so many quiet conversations years before, a retired engineer mentioned that a similar batch once had been halted in New Orleans due to a longshoreman's insistence. The comment traveled. It reached Daniel within days. That night, he visited his father and shared what he had heard. They said if that batch had gone through, it might have looked like what happened now. Raymond listened without expression. "Maybe," he said softly. Daniel sat for a long moment, watching twilight settle over the neighborhood. "I didn't understand it then," he admitted. "Thought you were making things harder than they had to be. Now I see you were stopping something before it ever had the chance." Raymond rested his elbows on the arms of his chair and looked at his son. The port stays standing because someone decides to look twice," he said. It wasn't instruction, it was memory. The conversation ended there, without dramatics or sentimentality. But something final had settled between them. The weight of that summer no longer belonged to one man alone. It had been carried forward, and that, more than recognition, was enough. By the early 2000s, the port of New Orleans had become something very different from the one Raymond had walked into as a young man decades earlier. The cranes were newer. The tracking systems were digital. Containers were scanned, recorded, and logged in databases that could be accessed in seconds. Audits were no longer rare interruptions, they were routine. Documentation no longer relied on carbon copies and memory. It lived in servers and backups. For many of the younger workers, this was simply how the world worked. They had never known a dock without cameras, without layered oversight, without structured compliance meetings. The idea that shipments once moved based largely on a man's word and a supervisor's nod sounded almost impossible to them, but Daniel knew better. By then, he had earned his place within the union, not through ambition, but through steadiness. He was not loud in meetings. He did not chase visibility. He carried himself the way his father had, measured, deliberate, observant. The younger men noticed, even if they couldn't quite explain why. One morning, during a union assembly, a proposal was introduced to adopt even stricter inspection procedures for high-risk industrial shipments. Dual verification, photographic documentation, cross-department review before offshore dispatch. Some of the older workers grumbled quietly. They had worked for years without those extra layers and believed experience should still count for something. That was when one of the gray-haired veterans, someone who had stood on those docks in 1974, rose slowly and asked to speak. He wasn't a man given to speeches, but that morning, his voice carried weight. There was a summer, he said, when something almost left this dock that shouldn't have. The room quieted. If one man hadn't insisted on looking twice, the story might have been different. He didn't dramatize. He didn't describe micro-fractures or certification numbers. He didn't need to. Trust matters, he finished, but trust doesn't replace checking. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but reflective. After the meeting, a young worker approached Daniel in the hallway. Who was he talking about? Daniel paused for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it carried meaning. "My father," he said. The young man nodded slowly, absorbing that fact as something more than trivia. That afternoon, Daniel drove to see Raymond. He found him, as he often did, sitting on the front porch with his hands folded loosely, watching the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. Age had thinned his frame and slowed his movements, but his eyes remained clear and steady. "They mentioned you today," Daniel said as he sat down beside him. Raymond glanced sideways, curious. "Did they?" Daniel told him about the assembly, about the proposal, about the old worker who had spoken up. Raymond listened without interruption. "They said if you hadn't stepped in back then, things could have gone bad." Raymond let the words settle before answering. "I didn't step in," he said gently. "I just didn't step aside." There was no pride in his voice, no attempt to magnify what had happened. Daniel studied his father for a long moment. "You know," he said, "there are men working offshore right now who have no idea their safety might have depended on something you did before I was even fully grown." Raymond looked toward the faint outline of the river beyond the trees. "That's fine," he said. "They don't need to know." The wind carried the distant horn of a passing ship. They both listened. Weeks later, the union voted unanimously to adopt the stricter inspection procedures. No heated debate, no political maneuvering, just agreement that certain standards, once learned the hard way, should not be forgotten. Shortly after that, the union quietly added a plaque to a wall in the main office, recognizing long-serving members who had strengthened safety practices over the decades. Raymond Boudreau's name was among them. Daniel brought him to see it. The plaque wasn't large. The engraving wasn't ornate, just names carved into brushed metal. Raymond stood in front of it for a long moment, reading the letters slowly, as if confirming they were real. "That'll do," he said quietly. He didn't touch the plaque. He didn't pose for photographs. He simply nodded once and stepped back. Time continued, as it always does. The port grew more efficient. Technology advanced further. Some of the older cranes were replaced entirely. Younger generations came in, trained under standards that now felt permanent. But beneath the layers of modernization, something older remained. A habit, a pause before approving, a willingness to question when something felt off. Daniel carried that habit openly. The younger supervisors who worked under him began carrying it too, often without realizing its origin. And when Raymond passed away on a calm morning, surrounded by family, there was no grand ceremony tied to the port, no official proclamation. But at the docks, word traveled. Men who had worked beside him decades earlier stood quietly during their break, hats in their hands, remembering not a dramatic confrontation, but a steady presence. One of them said softly, he kept the line straight. That was enough. Later that week, Daniel stood near the water after his shift ended, watching a cargo ship ease its way into the current. Containers stacked in neat rows, lights blinking in precise sequence, systems tracking every movement. The port was safer now, more controlled, more transparent, but Daniel understood something technology could never replace. All those systems depended still on someone willing to pause and ask whether something should move forward at all. In 1974, that someone had been his father. The tide had risen and fallen thousands of times since then. Ships had come and gone. Contracts had changed. Supervisors had retired. But the name Boudreaux remained clean on that river, not because it was protected by policy, not because it was shielded by luck, but because when the moment came, one man chose to carry the weight instead of passing it along. And on the docks, that is how a name stays. By the time the early 2000s settled over New Orleans, the port had transformed in ways Raymond could never have imagined when he first stepped onto the docks as a young man. Digital tracking systems now recorded every container that crossed the yard. Surveillance cameras covered angles that once relied solely on human attention. Inspection protocols were layered, documented, archived, and retrievable at a moment's notice. Younger workers entered the trade, already trained in compliance procedures that felt immovable and permanent. To them, it seemed as though the port had always operated this way, regulated, monitored, precise. Raymond never criticized the change. He understood progress the way a man understands weather. It comes whether you approve of it or not. But he also knew something the younger men did not yet fully grasp, that no system, no matter how modern, replaces the moment when a man must decide whether to look twice at something that feels wrong. Technology can record movement. It can document signatures. It can flag discrepancies. But it cannot replace character. Daniel had grown into his own authority by then. He had not inherited leadership. He had earned it slowly, through steadiness rather than ambition. He carried himself the way his father once had, calm, measured, rarely raising his voice. When questions arose during inspections, he did not dismiss them out of impatience. He leaned in, he reviewed, he verified. The younger workers began adopting that posture, often without realizing they were mirroring something older than themselves. During one union assembly discussing updated safety protocols for high-pressure industrial shipments, debate briefly surfaced about whether additional layers of review were necessary. Some argued that experience and instinct were enough. Others favored more documentation. It was not a heated argument, but it carried weight. In the middle of that discussion, an older dock worker who had been present in 1974 stood and spoke in a steady voice that silenced the room. He did not retell the entire story, nor did he describe cracked valves or duplicated certifications. He simply reminded them that there had once been a summer when something nearly left the dock that should not have, and that the reason it didn't had nothing to do with regulation and everything to do with one man refusing to ignore what he saw. Daniel felt the room shift as those words settled in. The younger men listened differently after that. The vote that followed passed without resistance. The additional inspection protocols were adopted not as burdens, but as extensions of responsibility. No one framed it as tribute. No one declared it a legacy decision. But those who understood, understood. Later that afternoon, Daniel visited Raymond, who was sitting on the porch in the quiet way he had come to favor in retirement. The years had thinned him, but had not bent him. He listened as Daniel described the meeting and the old worker's remarks. Raymond did not respond with pride or surprise. He nodded once and looked toward the distant river, as if measuring something only he could see. "I didn't do anything special," he said after a moment. "I just didn't let it pass." Daniel had long ago stopped arguing that point. He had seen enough by then to understand that what his father considered ordinary was, in fact, rare. In the months that followed, the union quietly placed a modest plaque in its office, recognizing long-serving members who had strengthened safety standards over the years. Raymond's name appeared among others who had contributed in ways large and small. There was no ceremony, no public announcement beyond the simple acknowledgement of service. When Daniel brought him to see it, Raymond stood in front of the engraved metal for a long time, without speaking. He traced the letters of his last name, lightly with his eyes, not his hand, and then stepped back. "That's enough," he said, and it was. Time moved forward, as it always does. Ships continued arriving before dawn. Cranes continued lifting against the Louisiana sky. New workers came in with clean gloves and strong backs, unaware of how many quiet decisions had shaped the standards they now took for granted. The Mississippi flowed as it had long before Raymond was born, and as it would long after his name faded from daily conversation. When he passed away on a calm morning, there were no headlines and no formal statements from corporate offices, but word reached the docks quickly. Men who had once stood beside him removed their caps during break and stood quietly, not because they were told to, but because they remembered. They did not remember a speech. They did not remember a confrontation. They remembered steadiness. They remembered a man who did not bend when bending would have been easier. Days later, Daniel stood alone near the water after finishing his shift. The port hummed behind him with the efficiency of the modern world. Digital logs updating, containers scanning, engines idling under computerized system. Yet as he watched a cargo ship ease into the current, he understood that beneath all of it remained the same fragile foundation that had always existed, a man's willingness to take responsibility before passing something forward. The tide rose and fell, as it always had. Ships came and went. Contracts shifted. Generations replaced one another. But the name Boudreaux remained unmarked on that river, not because it had been protected by policy or preserved by luck, but because when the moment arrived in the summer of 1974, one man chose to carry the weight instead of letting it drift downstream. And on the docks, that is how a name endures.